I have been told, more times than I can count, that I am a lucky man, and I have never once had the heart to correct the people who say it. They mean it kindly. They mean that I am alive, and that I have no business being alive, and that the arithmetic of the day I am going to tell you about should by every honest reckoning have ended with a small paragraph in the back of the newspapers and a black-bordered card sent round the palace. They are right about all of that. But luck is the wrong word, and I have spent the years since learning exactly how wrong, because luck is a thing that happens to you, and what happened to me was a thing that a young woman chose. She chose it in less time than it takes to draw a breath, with her whole life on the table and mine as the stake, and she chose me, a man she had spoken perhaps 40 words to in her life, and she paid for the choice with a year of pain I could not have borne and a limp she will carry to her grave. So no, not luck. I will not have it called luck in this account, whatever else I get wrong. My name will mean nothing to you dressed the way the heralds dress it, so I will give it to you plainly. I am Aldrich, and for 31 years I have been the Prince-Consort of Eldermoor, which is a grand way of saying that I married the woman who became queen, and then spent the rest of my life a careful half-step behind her right shoulder, holding the things she could not hold, and saying the things she was not permitted to say. It is not a role men are raised to want. I was not raised to want it. I was the second son of a minor house from the cold northern moors, a young man who liked horses and hated ceremony, and expected to spend his life managing a modest estate and arguing with tenants about drainage. Then I met Sarahland at a dreadful long dinner neither of us wanted to attend, and she looked at me across a forest of candlesticks, with an expression that said she found the whole affair exactly as ridiculous as I did, and that was the end of the life I had planned and the beginning of the one I was given. I have never regretted it. I say that so you understand what was at stake when the young woman made her choice. It was not a symbol she saved. It was a husband and a father, and a rather tired man of 62 who still, on the morning of the worst and best day of his life, expected to be home for supper. The day was the 9th of the 10th month, which in Eldermoor is the day we call Founder's Fair, and it is my favorite day in the whole crowded calendar of a royal year. Understand that most of what I do is indoors and gilded and stiff, ribbons and receptions, and the endless slow procession of important people who want 30 seconds of a royal face to hang their photograph on. Founder's Fair is not that. It is old and it is loud, and it belongs to the people in a way that almost nothing else we do belongs to them, and it moves. Every year the fair is held in a different market town, chosen by a rota that goes back further than anyone can properly explain, and the whole apparatus of the crown packs itself into a handful of cars and goes out into the real kingdom, the kingdom of muddy squares and stubborn old memorials and brass bands that play a little flat. And for one day, the family stands among the people in the open air with nothing between them but a rope and the good weather. That year the rota had landed on a town called Harnwick, which sits in a fold of the eastern hills where two rivers meet, a place of gray stone and steep streets, and about 11,000 souls, most of whom had turned out. It is a handsome town in a plain, honest way. There is a market square at its heart, cobbled and sloping, with a covered market cross at the bottom of the slope and at the top the war memorial, a tall gray column with the names of the town's dead cut into its four faces, and around it that morning a scaffold of autumn. Sheaves of wheat lashed to the railings, garlands of red and gold leaves, baskets of apples and squash and the last of the year's flowers, all of it the town's own doing, all of it made by hands that had waited 50 years for the fair to come back to Harnwick and meant to be ready when it did. I want you to see the square as I saw it that morning, because everything that happened there, in a space no larger than a good-sized garden, and the shape of it matters. Picture a slope of wet gray cobbles running downhill from the memorial at the top to the market cross at the bottom. Along the two long sides, market stalls, real ones, the fair's own traders, selling cheese and cloth and toffee and hot chestnuts, with striped awnings and hand-painted signs. Through the middle of the square, from top to bottom, an open lane had been kept clear and roped off on both sides for the royal party to walk. The crowd pressed 6 and 8 deep behind the ropes, everyone in their best, everyone patient, the whole town smelling of wood smoke and toffee and wet wool. At the top, before the memorial, a low wooden stage had been built for the speeches and the rededication, because part of Founders' Fare, the solemn part, is that the crown lays a wreath at the town's memorial and reads the names of that year's newly restored graves. And at the very top of the square, above the memorial, the cobbled lane bent away out of sight and ran downhill again on the far side toward the river and the old wool warehouses, a steep back street that no one in the square could see, and that no one in the square was thinking about at all. Hold on to that back street. It is where the trouble came from, and not one of the several hundred careful people whose job it was to keep us safe had thought to worry about it, for a reason that was perfectly sensible right up until the moment it nearly killed me. We arrived a little after 11. I remember the mood of it precisely, the particular good humor of a crowd that has waited a long time for a small thing and been rewarded. Sarah was radiant. She is always better in the open air and among ordinary people than she is in any palace, and the people of Harnwick knew it and gave it back to her doubled. She went straight to the rope, as she always does, and worked her way up the slope slower than the schedule liked, because there were a great many hands to shake, and a great many drawings to accept, and one very old man in a wheelchair, with a chest full of regimental medals, whom she stopped and spoke with for a full 4 minutes, while the equerry behind her quietly went to pieces about the timetable. I walked my half-step behind her right shoulder, doing my half of the work, which is the other rope, the other side of the lane, the people the Queen's attention has not yet reached, so that no one waits their whole morning in the cold and goes home having been looked at by no one at all. That is how I came to be where I was. That is the whole innocent reason. Sarah had reached the memorial stage at the top and gone up its 3 steps to begin the solemn part of the day, the wreath and the names, and I had stayed down on the cobbles at the top of the square, near where the roped lane opened out into the cleared ground before the stage, finishing the last of my side of the crowd, a knot of schoolchildren and their teachers who had made a banner. And behind them, a cluster of the town's older folk who had come out on canes and in chairs to see a thing they had not seen in half a century. I had stepped forward, off the marked line, out into the open cleared ground, to reach across and take the corner of the children's banner and read the words they had painted on it, because that is the job, the small human job, and because a man does not do that job from behind a rope. I had my back to the top of the square. I had my back to the bend in the cobbled lane where it ran away downhill out of sight toward the river. I was a 62-year-old man in a charcoal morning coat, bent slightly forward with a corner of painted canvas in my hand, reading aloud the words "Welcome home the fair" in a child's uneven capitals, and smiling, and entirely, perfectly, catastrophically unaware that anything in the whole bright morning could go wrong. And 30 feet behind me, at her post at the top of the square where the cleared ground met the memorial, one young member of the Royal Guard had gone very still. I did not see her go still. I have had it from a dozen witnesses since, and from her, in the one long conversation we have ever had about that day, and I have built it so many times in the years since that it has the texture of memory even though it is not mine, because she deserves to be seen doing the thing she did, and I am the only one left who cares enough to keep building it. Her name was Ivet Sorrel. She was a Lance-Corporal of the Eldermoor Royal Guard, very nearly the most junior rank a serving guard can hold and still be trusted with a post of her own at a public event, and she was 24 years old. She was, by every account I have gathered, unremarkable in exactly the way the best of them are unremarkable. She did her work, she made no trouble, and she had never in her short service done a single thing that anyone thought worth writing down. She came from a hill farm 2 valleys over from Harnwick, a detail that would matter enormously by the end of the day and mattered not at all in the moment. She was, that morning, exactly what she appeared to be, a young woman in a red tunic doing an ordinary duty on a bright autumn day. She was posted at the top of the square, facing down the slope, which put her back to the bend in the lane and the hidden street beyond it, the same blind quarter I had my own back to. But she was 30 feet nearer to it than I was, and she was standing, not bending forward over a banner. And she had the one thing that all the schedules and all the barriers and all the careful men in earpieces did not have, which was that she was listening to the whole of the morning and not just her small part of it. What she heard before anyone, a full 2 or 3 seconds before anyone, which in the arithmetic of that day was the whole of everything, was a sound that did not belong. It came from behind her and above her, from the hidden street beyond the bend, a sound she would tell me later she did not consciously identify at all. She did not think engine or brakes or lorry. She had no time for words. She simply heard, underneath the brass band and the crowd and the Queen's voice beginning the first of the names from the stage, a note that was wrong, a low-rising mechanical wrongness climbing out of the quarter of the morning that no one was watching, and her body turned toward it before her mind had finished telling her there was anything to turn toward. And that is where I have to stop building it from the outside and start telling you what came down that hidden street, because for the next 11 seconds the whole of my life, and the whole of hers, belonged to a thing that neither of us had done anything to deserve. The thing was a lorry. I have learned since to be precise about it, because a great many people in the days afterward wanted it to be something else, wanted it to be a plot, a threat, a wickedness with a face they could hate, and it was none of those things, and the truth of what it was is both smaller and, to my mind, far more frightening than any of the stories they preferred. It was a flatbed delivery lorry, 5 years old, well-maintained, belonging to a firm from the coast that supplied timber and building stone to the whole of the eastern hills. It was heavy, nearly 11 tons with its load of dressed stone still chained to the bed, and it was being driven that morning by a man named Corvin Aldhouse, who was 58 years old, who had held a heavy vehicle license for 31 years without a single mark against it, and who had, in his whole careful working life, never once had cause to think of himself as a danger to anyone. He was not part of the fair. That is the thing that undid every plan that had been made to keep me safe. The town of Harnwick had been closed to traffic for the fair, of course. The square and all the streets that fed it were shut behind barriers and marshals from 6 that morning. But the road that ran along the river at the very bottom of the hill, past the old wool warehouses, was not part of the fair and had not been closed, because it did not feed the square. It ran parallel to it, a level below, separated from the celebration by the whole steep tumble of the town. Corvin Aldhouse had a delivery to make to a builder's yard down by the river, a delivery that had nothing to do with the fair and no reason on earth to come anywhere near it, and he had planned his route the way he always did, keeping well clear of the closures. And he was, at the moment my whole life turned on its hinge, exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. Coming slowly up the steep river hill, in a low gear toward the turn that would take him along the water and away from all of us forever. And then on the steepest part of that hill, with 11 tons of stone at his back, Corvin Aldhouse's heart stopped. Not a fluttering, not a warning, not a hand pressed to a suddenly aching chest. The doctors were very clear with me afterward because I asked. I needed to understand the machine of it. It was a massive and instantaneous event, an electrical catastrophe in the muscle of the heart, the kind that takes a man out of the world between one breath and the next with no permission asked. One moment he was a careful driver in a low gear on a steep hill. The next moment he was not there at all, not dead yet, the doctors said, but gone, unconscious, his hand sliding off the wheel, his booted foot sliding off the pedals, his whole body a dead weight slumping sideways in the cab. and an 11-ton lorry loaded with stone, on the steepest hill in Harnwick, with no living hand on it, did the only thing that gravity would allow. It began, slowly and then not slowly at all, to roll back down. It should have rolled backward down the river hill and into the wall of the wool warehouse and stopped, and the only story of the day would have been a poor good man dead at his wheel and a lorry with a dented tailgate. That is what should have happened, and if the hill had been shaped even slightly differently, it is what would have happened. But the river hill was not straight. Near its top it kinked hard around the base of an old retaining wall, and the driverless lorry, rolling backward and gathering speed, did not follow the kink. It could not. There was no one to steer it. It went straight where the road turned, and it struck the low barrier at the top of the hill, a barrier meant to stop a stumbling pedestrian, not 11 tons of runaway stone, and it went through as though the barrier were made of paper, and came out of the kink not going backward down the river hill at all but going forward, nose first and gathering speed, into the mouth of the hidden cobbled lane that bent away above the memorial. The lane that ran downhill all its length, straight into the top of the market square, straight into the fair, straight into the cleared ground before the memorial stage, where the Queen of Eldermoor stood reading the names of the dead, and where I stood 30 feet in front of a young guardswoman with a corner of a child's banner in my hand and my back turned to my own death. 11 seconds. That is what the accident investigators reconstructed, later, from the marks on the cobbles and the pitch of the lane. 11 seconds from the moment the lorry burst through the barrier at the top of the hidden lane to the moment it reached the square. 11 seconds in which a driverless machine heavier than a house came down a narrow cobbled street, its engine dead, making almost no sound but the low grinding rush of its own great weight and the scream of its tires on wet stone. 11 seconds in which several hundred trained people, every one of them facing the wrong way, remained completely unaware that death was coming down on them from the one quarter no plan had thought to guard. 11 seconds, of which Ivet Sorrel used the first 2 or 3 to do the thing that saved my life, which was, simply to turn around. She turned toward the wrongness she had heard, up the slope, toward the bend in the lane, and she saw it a heartbeat before it came fully into view, saw the nose of the thing lunge out of the hidden street into the top of the square, saw it swing wide and clip the corner of the first stall and send a striped awning and a cascade of apples flying, saw it straighten, dreadfully, and pick its line down the open cleared ground with the blind logic of gravity, and she understood. In the way that takes no time at all because it uses no words, 3 things at once. She understood what it was. She understood where it was going. And she understood, this is the part I cannot get past, the part I have turned over 10,000 times in the dark. That of all the several hundred people in that square, she was the only one positioned, by the pure blind accident of where the duty roster had put her that morning, to do anything about it at all. Because the lorry was not aimed at the Queen. The Queen was up on the stage, 3 steps and a stout wooden rail above the cleared ground, off to the side, out of the line. The guard around Saraland were already moving, I am told, already turning at the first crash of the stall, already flinging themselves up onto that stage and around that small woman in her bright coat with the instant reflexive shelter of their own bodies, and they did their job and did it perfectly, and she was never in the true line of it for a single instant. The men trained and posted to protect the Queen protected the Queen. That is not a criticism of them. It is the whole tragedy and mercy of the geometry. But the lorry, coming straight down the open cleared ground on its blind gravity line, was aimed exactly, precisely, as though the whole indifferent machinery of the world had drawn a ruled line for it, at a bent-over man in a charcoal coat holding the corner of a child's banner, a man too far from the stage to be swept up with the Queen, a man with his back turned, a man who was, in the arithmetic of those 11 seconds, already dead and did not know it. That man was me. And the only living soul who had turned in time to see it, the only one close enough and quick enough and free enough to reach me before the lorry did, was a 24-year-old Lance-Corporal from a hill farm 2 valleys over, who had perhaps 4 seconds left to cross the ground between us, and who did not hesitate, so far as any witness could see, for even the smallest part of one of them. I still had the banner in my hand. I was still smiling at the children. I was still, in my own experience of that morning, entirely safe. And behind me, closing the gap at a dead sprint with her rifle already gone from her shoulder and thrown clear so it could not foul what she meant to do, Ivet Sorrel was 3 strides away, and 2, and 1, and I heard at the very last, a single word shouted so close and so hard against my ear that I felt the breath of it. A word that was not get down and was not SIR, and was not, in fact, any word at all, but only the raw shape of a human voice pushed past its limit. And then the whole world struck me in the side like the fist of God, and lifted me off my feet, and threw me sideways off the line of my own death and into the rest of my life. I have tried over the years to remember the moment of the impact itself, and I cannot, and the doctors tell me I never will and should be glad of it. There is the banner in my hand and the child's uneven capitals and the smell of toffee, and then there is a hole, a blank, a nothing. And then there is the cobblestones very close to my face and a ringing in my ears like a struck bell and a pain in my shoulder and hip that I did not yet have the sense to be frightened of. Between the banner and the cobblestones there is nothing at all, and into that nothing went the worst 3 seconds of Ivet Sorrel's life, and I was not present for them, and I have had to be told. What she did, and I have this from the accident men, who reconstructed it from the marks and the film, and from the 2 constables who were nearest, and from the terrible, patient replaying of 100 phones, was not a rescue as the storybooks draw a rescue. There was no time to reach me and pull me and run us both clear. The geometry did not allow it, the same way it had not allowed the men on the stage to do anything but shelter the queen where she stood. Ivet had 4 seconds and 30 feet, and an 11-ton weight bearing down, and she spent the 4 seconds crossing the 30 feet at the dead flat sprint of a young woman who had grown up running up hillsides after sheep, and she arrived at my side with the lorry perhaps 2 of its own lengths behind her, and she did the only thing that 4 seconds and 30 feet allowed, which was to hit me. She did not push. A push is a polite thing, a thing you do to a door. She hit me, put her shoulder and the whole driving weight of her body low into my side and hip, the way I am told they are taught to drive a man off his feet when there is no time for anything gentler, and she hit me with everything she had and everything she was, and she kept her legs driving under her even after the impact, so that she did not merely knock me over but carried me, drove me, 3 full paces sideways across the cobbles and off the ruled line of the lorry's descent. 3 paces. That is what my life cost, in the end. 3 paces of wet cobblestone, bought with the whole strength of a 24-year-old body thrown against mine. And the driving of me those 3 paces put her, exactly and inevitably, where I had been. I want to be careful here because she has asked me to be, and because the cheap papers were not, and I owe her better than they gave her. I will not draw you the picture they drew. I will tell you only what is true and what she has permitted me to say. The lorry did not strike her the way it would have struck me, head-on, square, a bent-over, unready man. Her own momentum, the sideways carry of the 2 of us, meant that at the last instant she and I were both moving across the line rather than standing in it, and that made the whole difference between the 2 of us in the end. I was clear. She was not quite clear. The great blind edge of the thing that would have killed me caught her instead. Not fully, not squarely. The mercy of physics gave her that much. But it caught her, along her back and her leg, and it took her down and under and dragged her. And the sound that the crowd made then is a sound I did not hear, because I was 3 paces away on the cobbles with a hole in my memory, and I am glad past all telling that I did not hear it. And then the lorry, having done its worst, at last did the one kind thing it was ever going to do. The cleared ground before the memorial rose, very slightly, toward the stage the whole square sloped, and the stage sat at its high edge, And the runaway, having spent its speed on the long descent and the striking of the stall and the dreadful arithmetic of Ivet Sorrel's body, met that last small rise with a dead engine and no more hill to feed it, and it slowed, and it faltered, and it came at last to rest with its crumpled nose against the very base of the memorial stage, gently almost. The way a spent wave lays itself down on a beach, it did not reach the stage, it did not reach the Queen. It stopped 6 feet short of the wooden rail behind which the men of the guard stood with their bodies flung around Sarreland, and it stood there steaming and ticking in the sudden enormous silence. 11 tons of stone and steel come to rest in the middle of a market fair, and inside its cab a good man was already gone, and behind it on the cobbles lay a young woman who had, in 11 seconds, done a thing that 11,000 people would remember for the rest of their lives. The silence lasted perhaps a second and a half. I know the length of it because I have heard it since, on the recordings I forced myself to watch. The whole square struck dumb, 10,000 people holding one breath. And then the silence broke, all at once, into the sound that 10,000 people make when the horror of a thing arrives in all of them together. And cutting across it came the voices of the men and women whose whole training was for exactly this, closing on the wreck, and on the 2 of us on the cobbles with the terrible controlled speed that is. I have learned the most frightening and the most reassuring thing in the world to be near. I was coming back into the morning by then. The cobblestones very close to my face, the ringing bell, the pain arriving now in earnest in my shoulder and hip, a broken collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, a hip that would ache in cold weather for the rest of my days, and a mind so wrung and rattled that I would not be permitted to make a single decision of any importance for a fortnight. But I was alive, and I was aware, and the first coherent thought that assembled itself out of the ringing was not for myself at all. It was a question, and the question was, where is she? And I could not have told you in that moment who she was. I did not know her name. I did not know her face. I knew only, with the deep animal certainty of a creature that has been saved, that something had struck me out of the path of my death, and that the something had been a person, and that the person was not now beside me. And I began, with a broken collarbone and 3 cracked ribs and no permission at all, to try to turn myself over on the cobbles to find her. Hands stopped me. Gentle, firm, insistent hands, and a voice close to my ear saying the flat, calming, repeated things that trained people say, "Lie still, sir, you're safe, don't move, lie still." And I fought them weakly, uselessly, because I had to see, and they held me down because moving me might kill me. And it was in that small pinned struggle on the cobblestones of Harnwick Square that I first understood, before I understood anything else, before I even knew her name, that I had been given my life by a stranger, and that I would spend whatever was left of it trying to be worthy of the gift. They would not let me see her. Not then. It was hours before I saw her, and by then everything had changed, because the saving of a life is only the first 3 seconds of the story. What it costs and who pays it, and whether the paying was in vain, that is the rest, and the rest is the part that matters. They took me to the cottage hospital in Harnwick first, and then, when the doctors there had decided I would live, by ambulance the long, careful hour to the county infirmary, and Sarreland rode the whole hour beside me holding my good hand and saying almost nothing, because there was nothing to say that either of us could bear to say aloud. She had not been hurt. I need you to know that. It is the first thing everyone wants to know. The Queen of Eldermoor was never in the true path of that lorry, and the men who guarded her did their work faultlessly, and she walked off that stage on her own 2 feet, white to the lips and shaking, but unharmed. It was her husband, of all the people in the square, whom the blind machine had chosen, and it was a girl of 24 who had paid for the choosing, and Sarreland sat beside me carrying the whole weight of both of those facts, and I have never loved her more than I did in that silent, terrible hour, nor been less able to comfort her. Because I could not stop asking about the girl. I asked in the cottage hospital and they did not know. I asked in the ambulance and Sarreland did not know or would not say, which came at that moment to the same thing. I asked the surgeon who set my collarbone at the infirmary, a brisk, kind man who told me to be quiet and let him work, and I would not be quiet, and at last, because I was the prince consort, and because I would clearly give him no peace, he sent someone to find out, and the someone came back with a face that told me most of what I did not want to know before he had said a single word. She was alive. That was the first thing, and I made him say it twice because I could not trust my wrung and rattled ears. She was alive, and she was in the same infirmary, 2 floors below me, and she was in surgery and had been for some hours, and the surgery was not finished and would not be finished for some hours more, and no one could yet tell me anything past that, because no one yet knew. Her back had been hurt. Her right leg, had been very badly hurt, so badly that the words the young man used, carefully, watching my face, were words about whether it could be saved at all. She had lost a great deal of blood on the cobbles before they reached her. She had not, so far as anyone could tell me, woken since the impact. And her mother was being driven in from the hill farm 2 valleys over, a woman who had risen that morning proud that her daughter would be standing guard at the fair, and who did not yet know why the palace car had come to her gate. I lay in that infirmary bed with my strapped shoulder and my taped ribs, and I wept, which I had not done in front of another human being in 40 years, and Saralind held my hand and let me, and neither of us pretended it was anything other than what it was. I did not know that young woman. I would learn, exchanged perhaps 40 words with her across the whole of her 3 years of service. The small courtesies of a man who makes a point of learning something of the people who stand at his back, a good morning, a bad weather for it, once a question about where she was from, and an answer about a hill farm and sheep that I had half forgotten until that day. 40 words. And she had crossed 30 feet of cobblestone at a dead run, and put her body between me and 11 tons of falling stone without, so far as any witness could see, 1/2 second of hesitation, and now she lay 2 floors below me fighting for her leg and perhaps her life, and I was alive because of it, and the disproportion of it, the sheer arithmetic obscenity of it, was a thing I did not then know how to hold and have not entirely learned to hold since. It was in those hours, the long gray hours of the afternoon and evening, while the surgeons 2 floors below fought for Ivet Sorrel's leg, that I began to learn who she was, because I could not bear to lie there and not know, and because the machinery of the palace, once it understood what I wanted, is very good at finding things out. They brought me what they had. It was not much at first, and every scrap of it undid me a little further. She was the eldest of 3. Her father had died when she was 15, a farm accident, a tractor on a wet slope, the ordinary cruelty of hill country, and she had, at 15, become in effect the second parent of the family, running the farm alongside her mother through the hard years, sending her younger brother and sister to school, doing a grown woman's work in a child's body, because the work would not wait for her to grow. She had joined the guard at 21, not for glory, so far as anyone who knew her could tell. The pay was steady, and it was sent home, most of it month after month, to keep the farm and the brother and the sister. But there was more to it than the pay, her sergeant told me later, because there is always more to it than the pay with the ones who are truly good at it, and she had been quietly one of the truly good ones. Not showy, not ambitious. She had turned down, twice, the chance to try for a more visible and better paid posting, because the visible postings meant the capital, and the capital meant she could not get home to the farm on her leave days, and getting home to the farm, to her mother and the sheep and the 2 valleys and the grave on the hillside, was the whole of what she wanted from a leave day. That was the young woman who had chosen me, a girl who sent her wages to a hill farm and turned down promotion so she could get home to help with the lambing, and she had spent all of it, the whole careful, self-sacrificing shape of a life, bent toward the keeping of the people she loved, in 3 seconds and 3 paces of cobblestone, for a man she had exchanged 40 words with. I lay in the dark, and I could not make it balance, and I have never been able to make it balance, and I have only slowly come to understand that it was never meant to, that the thing she did was not a trade of her worth against mine, but something that does not live on the same ledger as worth at all. Near midnight, a surgeon came up to me. Not the one who had set my collarbone, a different man, older, in the green of the operating theater, with the particular gray exhaustion of someone who has spent 9 hours doing the most delicate and terrible work there is. He sat down in the chair beside my bed without being asked, which I have since learned is a thing surgeons do only when the news is either very good or very bad, and I braced myself for the worst, and he gave me instead the first mercy of that whole long day. She would live. The surgery was finished and she would live, and he was cautious. He was a careful man and he would promise me nothing, but he allowed himself this much: they had saved the leg. It would be a long road. The word he used was reconstruction, and he used it the way a man uses a word he knows the true weight of and does not want to frighten you with. She would not walk unaided for months. She might never run again, never chase a sheep up a hillside again, though he did not know to say it that way, and I did not tell him. She would carry the marks of that morning in her body for the rest of her life, and she would very likely walk with a limp until the day she died. But she would live, and she would walk, and she would keep her leg, and after the day I had had those 3 facts landed on me like a benediction, and I gripped that exhausted surgeon's hand in my one good hand, and I could not speak, and he understood, and he let me not speak, and then he went away to find the next family and give them, if he was lucky, the same small mercy. She would live. I said it over and over to myself in the dark of the infirmary. She would live. And I made in that dark, lying broken and grateful and unable to sleep, the first of the promises that would shape the rest of my life, and it was a simple one, and I have kept it. I promised that whatever it took, however long it took, whatever it cost me in the currency I actually possessed, time, attention, patience, the stubbornness of a man who does not let go of a thing, the young woman 2 floors below me would never, for one single day of the rest of her life, have cause to wonder whether the thing she had done had been seen and understood and honored and repaid as far as a thing like that can ever be repaid. I did not yet know how hard that promise would be to keep. I did not know that the honoring of Ivet Sorrel would turn out to require, in the weeks to come, a fight, a real fight, against people I would not have expected to have to fight, and that the fight would teach me more about my own kingdom, and about the quiet machinery of how the powerful decide what a life is worth, than 31 years of gilded rooms had ever taught me. But that came later. That first night there was only the dark and the promise and the 2 words I said until at last, near dawn, they let me sleep. She would live. She would live. She would live. The fight I have mentioned did not announce itself with trumpets. Nothing that truly matters ever does. It came, the first sign of it, in the shape of a pleasant, apologetic, deeply reasonable man in a good gray suit who came to sit by my infirmary bed on the 3rd morning, when I was strong enough to hold a conversation and still weak enough to be managed, and who explained to me, with enormous gentleness and a great many soft words, why it would be best for everyone if the whole affair were allowed, gradually and with dignity, to fade. His name, I will call him Farron, which was not his name, because the man matters less than the thing he stood for, and there are versions of him in every court and every large institution that has ever existed. He was a private secretary, in plainer language, one of the small number of very capable people who actually run the daily machinery of the crown. He was not a bad man. The temptation, in a story like this, is to make the man in the gray suit a villain, and he was not a villain, and pretending he was would let the rest of us off too easily. He believed, sincerely, that he was protecting the crown, and behind the crown the kingdom, and behind the kingdom a great many ordinary people whose stability depended on the whole edifice not being seen to wobble. That is what men like Farron always believe, and it is what makes them dangerous, because a man who believes he is protecting everyone can talk himself into almost anything. What he wanted was simple, once you unwrapped it from the soft words. He wanted the incident closed. The driver was dead, A heart attack, a tragedy, no blame. The case would be recorded as a pure accident, which it was, and the file closed. The prince consort had been injured but would recover. A statement of gratitude for the public's concern, and then a discreet withdrawal from the public eye for a decent interval. And the guardswoman, here he was at his gentlest, his most reasonable, his most infuriating. The guardswoman had done her duty, of course, and it would be recognized, of course, in the proper way, at the proper time, through the proper channels. A commendation, a mention in the appropriate list. Perhaps, in due course, a small ceremony, private, dignified. But he did hope, he said, that I would understand the wisdom of not his words. I have never forgotten them, of not inflating the episode into a spectacle. A great public honoring, he explained, a parade of it, a making of the young woman into a symbol, would be in the long run unkind to her. It would fix her forever as the girl the lorry hit, rob her of any ordinary life afterward, expose her family to a scrutiny they had not asked for. Far better, he said, the quiet path. Far better to let her heal in peace and be quietly looked after and allowed to fade back into the ranks and the life she had chosen. Far kinder, far wiser. Would I not agree? I very nearly did. That is the part I am least proud of, and the part I insist on telling, because it is the truest part. Lying there strapped and grateful and rung like a bell, I very nearly agreed, because everything he said was reasonable, and because he was so kind about it, and because there is in every one of us a deep, exhausted longing to be told that the difficult thing has been thought about by someone competent and taken care of and need not trouble us. I opened my mouth to agree. And then I remembered the surgeon saying she might never run up a hillside again, and I remembered a girl of 15 becoming the second parent of a family on a wet slope in hill country, and I remembered the raw shape of the voice against my ear in the last instant before the world struck me, and I closed my mouth, and I looked at the pleasant, reasonable man in the good gray suit, and I said no. I did not say it well. I was in no condition to say anything well, but I said it, and I kept saying it in the days that followed against a rising tide of the softest and most reasonable pressure I have ever been subjected to, and the saying of it became, for a while, the whole purpose of my convalescence, the thing that got me up in the mornings when the pain and the grief would otherwise have kept me flat. Because I had understood something lying there that Farrant in all his competence had not understood, or had understood and set aside as inconvenient. I had understood that the quiet path he was offering was not kindness. It was the opposite of kindness dressed in kindness's clothes. It was the machinery of the powerful doing what the machinery of the powerful always does with an inconvenient act of goodness by a person of no importance. It files it, it commends it, it looks after it quietly, and it makes very sure that it never becomes large enough to require anything real of anyone. A commendation costs nothing. A mention in a list costs nothing. What Ivet Sorrel had done for me had cost her a leg, and I would be damned, strapped and broken in that infirmary bed, before I would let the men in the gray suits pay for it in a currency that cost them nothing at all. But I am getting ahead of the story, and ahead of myself, because before any of that fight could be fought I had first to do the thing I most wanted and most dreaded to do in the whole world, which was to meet her. They let me see her on the 5th day. I had been asking since the 1st, and being gently refused. She was too ill, then too heavily sedated, then too fragile, but on the 5th day the older surgeon, the exhausted one, decided that it would do her more good than harm, and I was wheeled, protesting at the wheelchair, and overruled, down 2 floors and along a green corridor to a small quiet room where a young woman I had never truly looked at in 3 years lay in a white bed with her right leg held in a frame of steel and pins, and turned her head on the pillow when the door opened, and saw the Prince-Consort of Eldermoor being wheeled into her hospital room, and did the single most characteristic thing I would ever know her to do. She tried to sit up. She tried, broken and pinned, and 5 days out of 9 hours of surgery, to come to attention. Her whole body flinched with the effort and the pain of it, and a machine beside her bed made an alarmed sound, and a nurse started forward, and I heard myself say, in a voice I did not recognize, "No, no, please, Lance-Corporal, at ease. That is, I am ordering you at ease." Which is not a thing a prince-consort has any business ordering anyone. I hold no rank in the guard, but it was the only language I could think of that might reach her, and it did. She stopped trying to rise. She lay back, breathing hard, and she looked at me across that small green room with an expression I have spent years trying to name and have never quite managed. And the nearest I can come is that it was the expression of a person who is deeply, genuinely, almost comically embarrassed to have caused a fuss. "I'm sorry, sir," were the first words Ivet Sorrel ever said to me across that room, 5 days after she had given me my life. "I'm sorry, about your shoulder, I heard it go. I couldn't, there wasn't a way to do it soft. I'm sorry." She was apologizing to me. She was lying in a steel frame with a reconstructed leg and a back full of stitches, and the first thing she thought to say to the man she had saved was an apology for having broken his collarbone in the saving of him. I looked at that, and I understood, in a way that no report and no dossier could have made me understand, exactly what kind of person had chosen me on the cobblestones of Harnwick. And I understood that the fight against the men in the gray suits was not going to be a fight I could decline, no matter how tired I was, because a person like this would never, ever fight it for herself. I stayed longer in her room that first day than the nurses wished, and I went back the next day, and the next, and slowly, across those visits, in the awkward, halting, unhurried way that is the only way real trust is ever built, Ivet Sorrel and I began to be something to each other that neither of us had a name for. Not friends, exactly. The distance of rank and age and the strange debt between us made friends too small a word and too large a claim all at once. But something. She stopped apologizing after a while, which I counted a victory. She told me about the farm and the sheep, and the 2 rivers, and her brother who wanted to be an engineer and her sister who was clever and impatient and wasted, Ivet thought, in a small country school. She told me these things reluctantly at first, and then, once she understood that I truly wanted to hear them, with a plain, unguarded warmth that was the real Ivet, the one underneath the correct young guardswoman, the one who had grown up loving a hard place and a hard life, and a family she would do anything for. Had already done anything for, on a stranger, on a set of cobblestones, without pausing to ask whether the stranger was worth it. And in those same days, while I was learning who she was, the kingdom was learning too, because the one thing the men in the gray suits had not reckoned with was the 10,000 people who had been in the square, and the 100 phones that had filmed it, and the simple, ungovernable fact that a thing which happens in front of 10,000 people cannot be quietly filed away no matter how good the gray suit. The film of it was everywhere within a day. Not the worst of it. A mercy of angle and distance meant that the true horror of the impact was not clearly caught by any of the phones, and I remain grateful past words for that. But the shape of it was caught over and over from a dozen vantages. The good-humored fare, the bent man at the banner, the red figure suddenly sprinting, the collision of bodies, the sideways carry, the man flung clear, the young woman not flung clear, the great steaming wreck come to rest 6 feet from a stage. And the kingdom, watching it over and over, did the thing that the men in the gray suits had been so anxious to prevent. It fell in love with her. Not with the prince-consort. I was, at best, the fortunate cargo, the thing that had been saved, and I minded that far less than Ferrant seemed to think I should. It fell in love with the girl in the red tunic who had run at 11 tons of falling stone for a stranger. The letters began to come, sackfuls of them, to the palace and the infirmary, and soon, to a hill farm 2 valleys over. The town of Harnwick itself gathered outside the infirmary in a quiet nightly vigil, hundreds of people simply standing in the cold with candles, because they did not know what else to do with what they felt. A fund was started. I had nothing to do with it. It rose up out of the country on its own, and it filled so fast that within a week it was an embarrassment, and within 2 a small fortune. And for a while, this is the false dawn, and I did not recognize it as one until it broke. It seemed to me that I had won my fight without having to fight it at all. The country had decided. The men in the gray suits, whatever they privately wished, could hardly file away a thing the whole kingdom was weeping over. A great honoring seemed not merely possible but inevitable. I let myself believe that goodness had for once been too large and too loud to be managed, that Ivet Sorrel would be honored as she deserved and her family made secure. I even said as much to her, one afternoon, clumsily, meaning to comfort her. I told her the country loved her, that she need never worry about the farm again, that everything would be taken care of. And I watched her face close, very slightly, at the words, and I did not understand why, and I was too pleased with my false dawn to ask. The setback came from a direction I had not thought to guard, and it came, as the worst blows always do, wrapped in the appearance of fairness. There was to be an inquiry. Of course there was. A man had died and a member of the royal family had been gravely injured, and 11 tons of stone had come to rest in a market square, and no kingdom worth the name let such a thing pass without asking, formally and thoroughly, how it had been allowed to happen. I had assumed the inquiry would be a simple and even a healing thing, that it would establish what everyone already knew, that a good man's heart had stopped, and a chain of small, ordinary decisions about which roads to close had left a gap that no one had foreseen, and that the kingdom would learn from it and close the gap and be safer. And in the end, that is more or less what the inquiry did. But an inquiry is a machine with many hands, and some of the hands that reached into it were not interested in healing at all. Because there were, it turned out, a great many people whose comfort and whose reputations depended on the question of blame, and blame is a slippery thing, and it will always, if it can, roll downhill to land on the person least able to push it back up. The firm that owned the lorry did not want the blame. Their driver had been faultless, their vehicle sound, and they were right, and they were frightened. The men who had planned the road closures did not want the blame. They had followed the standing procedures exactly, and the procedures had simply never imagined a driverless runaway from an unclosed parallel road, and they were right too, and they were more frightened still, because their procedures were about to be found wanting in front of the whole kingdom. And somewhere in the machinery of the inquiry, in the quiet way these things happen, a question began to be asked that I had never in my life imagined could be asked, and when it reached me, I could not at first believe it was serious. The question was whether the guardswoman had acted correctly. The question was whether, in leaving her post and crossing the cleared ground to strike the Prince-Consort off his feet, Lance-Corporal Ivet Sorrel had followed her standing orders. Because her standing orders, it was pointed out, by people who had clearly never in their lives had 4 seconds to decide anything, placed the protection of the Queen above all other considerations, and Ivet had, in the strictest and most literal reading, turned her back on the direction of the Queen and run the other way. The question was whether a guard who abandoned the geometry of the sovereign's protection to save the consort had, whatever the outcome, breached the discipline on which the whole institution rested. The question was whether the thing she had done, the bravest and most selfless thing I have ever witnessed or ever expect to witness, was, in the cold language of the standing orders, a fault. I read the document in which that question was first set down in its careful bloodless prose, and I understood at last that my false dawn had been exactly that, and that the fight I had thought I had won without fighting had not even properly begun. Because the men in the gray suits had found, in the machinery of the inquiry, a far more elegant tool than a quiet filing away. They did not need to argue that Ivet should not be honored. They needed only to allow a small persistent question to be raised about whether she had, technically, done wrong, and a person who is under a question cannot be made a hero, and the honoring would have to wait decently until the question was resolved, and questions in the hands of frightened institutions can be made to take a very, very long time to resolve, long enough for the country's love to cool, Long enough for the story to fade. Long enough for a girl from a hill farm to heal in obscurity and go quietly back to the ranks, honored by no one, her act reduced to a line in a file marked conduct, under review. And the worst of it, the thing that got me out of the infirmary bed on my own 2 feet 3 days earlier than the doctors wished, the thing that turned my grief into something harder and more useful, was that when I went down to her room in a fury to tell her what was being done to her, and to promise her that I would tear it down, I found that she already knew. Someone had told her, or she had guessed. She was not a stupid woman, and she knew the machinery she served better than I did. And she was not angry. That was the thing I could not bear. She lay in her steel frame, and she looked at me with those plain, unguarded eyes, and she said, quietly, that she understood, that the orders were the orders and were there for good reasons, and that if the inquiry found she had breached them, then she had breached them, and that was that. She said she would rather they took her rank than her leg, and she almost smiled when she said it, and I realized that she had already, in her own mind, accepted the whole unjust weight of it, because accepting the whole unjust weight of things was the only way she had ever known how to live. No, I told her. I was standing by then, gripping the rail of her bed, shaking with the effort of standing and the effort of the thing I felt. No, not this time. You have spent your whole life carrying what other people should have carried, and you are not going to carry this. This one is mine to carry. Do you understand me? This one you are going to let me carry. She looked at me for a long moment, and something moved in her face that I had not seen there before, and she said, "You don't have to, sir." And I said, "I know I don't have to. That is rather the entire point." And for the first time since the cobblestones, Ivet Sorrel laughed, a small, surprised, painful laugh, quickly stifled for the sake of her stitches. And I knew that whatever it cost me, and whatever it cost me with the men in the gray suits whom I had spent 31 careful years never crossing, I was going to win this fight or die trying, and that I would rather lose everything I had than see that laugh replaced by the quiet acceptance of an injustice she was too good to protest. The trouble was that I had no idea how to win it. I was a prince consort. I held no rank, commanded no one, sat on no council that mattered. My whole power was borrowed, a reflection of my wife's and my wife. This is the last and hardest thing I have to tell you before I can tell you how it turned. My wife, the queen, the one person in the kingdom who could have ended the whole shameful business with a single word, had not yet said that word, and I did not know why, and the not knowing was, for a few dark days, the loneliest thing I have ever endured. I confronted her about it. I am not proud of the way I did it. I was frightened and in pain, and running on the fumes of a righteous anger. I did not know how to aim, and I came at her one evening in the private rooms we had taken near the infirmary, and I asked her, not gently, why she had said nothing. Why the woman I had married 31 years before, the woman who had crouched on cold flagstones for a little boy with a drawing, the woman whose whole reign had been built on being better than the machinery she inherited, had let the men in the gray suits raise their filthy little question about a girl who had given her leg for the queen's own husband, and had not, in a week and more, said one single public word to stop them. Saralind let me finish. She has always let me finish. It is one of the 10,000 small mercies of being married to her. And when I had finished and stood there breathing hard and half ashamed already of my own tone, she put down the paper she had been reading. She had been reading, I saw too late, a thick document I did not recognize, and she looked at me with an expression that stopped my anger in my throat, because it was not the expression of a woman who had been doing nothing. It was the expression of a woman who had been doing a very great deal, quietly in the dark, the way she does the things that matter most. "Aldrich," she said, "sit down before you fall down, and listen to me, because I am only going to explain this once, and then I am going to need your help." I sat down. She explained. She had said nothing in public, she told me, for the same reason a good general does not fire his cannon at the first skirmisher. A single royal word from her early would have won the small fight and lost the large one. She could have ordered the question about Ivet's conduct struck from the inquiry with a sentence, yes, and the men in the gray suits would have bowed and struck it, and the honoring would have gone ahead, and Ivet Sorrel would have received her medal and her mention in the list, and the whole thing would have been in a season, forgotten, exactly as Ferrant wished, only with a medal on top. She would have won my fight, the small fight, the fight about one brave girl. And she would have missed the thing the whole disaster had shown her, the thing she had been sitting up night after night with lawyers and engineers and the gray-faced men from the road authority to understand, the thing in the thick document on the table between us. Because Saraland, it turned out, had not been fighting to honor one guardswoman. She had been fighting to make sure that what had happened in Harnwick Square could never happen again. And to do that she had needed not to end the inquiry but to seize it, to let it run and gather every uncomfortable fact it could reach, and then to stand at the end of it and force the whole kingdom to look at what it found. And what it had found, in the 2 weeks while I lay believing she was doing nothing, was a catalogue of quiet failures that no single medal could ever have addressed. It had found that the road authorities' closure procedures for public events had not been reviewed in 30 years and did not account for driverless runaways at all. It had found that heavy goods vehicles on steep routes carried no requirement for the automatic braking systems that had existed for a decade and would have stopped Corvin Aldhouse's lorry dead the instant his foot left the pedal. It had found that the man himself had had a heart condition that a single screening, not then required for his license, would very likely have caught in time to save his life and prevent the whole catastrophe. It had found, in short, that the accident which had cost Ivet Sorrel her leg had not been an act of God at all, but the sum of a dozen small failures of care, each one fixable, none of them fixed, and Saraland meant to fix everyone. And to do that she needed the inquiry alive and its findings public and its shame fully felt, which she could not have if she smothered it in its cradle to win one girl a medal. So I let them raise their question, she said, and her voice was very level, and underneath the level I heard the anger she had been holding for 2 weeks, an anger so much colder and more patient and more dangerous than my hot, useless kind. I let them raise it because the moment they raised it, they told me exactly who they were and exactly what they valued, and they did it in writing in the record where I can reach it. They think they have found a way to bury the girl. What they have actually done, Aldrich, is hand me the rope. I did not fully understand her then. I understood her 3 days later when she rose in front of the assembled inquiry, and in front of the cameras she had made very sure would be present, and did the thing she had been building toward in the dark for 2 weeks. She did not plead for Ivet. She did not appeal to sentiment or to the country's love or to the medal or the mention in the list. She was far too clever and far too angry for anything so easily brushed aside. Instead she took up, one by one in her level unhurried voice, the findings of the inquiry, the unreviewed procedures, the missing braking systems, the unrequired screening, the whole catalogue of small unfixed failures, and she laid them out before the kingdom as what they were, not the guardswoman's failure, but the institution's. And then she turned to the question the men in the gray suits had raised, the question of whether Lance-Corporal Sorrel had breached her standing orders by leaving her post, and she answered it, and her answer is the thing I will carry to my own grave. I am told, she said, that there is a question about whether this young woman followed her orders. Let me answer it plainly so that no one need ask it again. Her orders were to protect the crown. She protected the crown. I do not mean the object. I mean the thing the object stands for, a kingdom in which the strong are asked to spend themselves for the weak, in which the person nearest to the danger is expected to meet it so that others need not, in which duty is not a word we carve on memorials to the dead, but a thing we do in the open in 3 seconds for a stranger at the cost of our own bodies. That is the crown. She did not turn her back on it. She ran toward it, faster and truer than any of the rest of us, and it is not she who is under question here today. It is the rest of us. It is every procedure that was not reviewed and every safeguard that was not required and every quiet decision that a life like the driver's, or a life like my husband's, or a life like this young woman's leg, was not quite worth the cost of protecting. She answered a question the rest of us had been too comfortable to ask, and I will not stand in this kingdom and watch her punished for having the courage to answer it. The question of her conduct is closed. The question of ours is now open, and it will stay open until every failure this inquiry has found is fixed. I have watched the recording of that speech more times than is good for me. I watch, every time, the faces of the men in the gray suits as they understand, one by one, that the rope they thought they had handed a sentimental old husband has been taken up instead by the coldest and cleverest fighter in the kingdom, and that it is now around their own necks, and that there is nothing they can do about it because she has said it all in the open, on the record, in the plain, unanswerable language of a queen who has decided to stop being managed. And I watch Farrant at the edge of the frame, and I will give him this. I watch something in his careful, competent face give way, and I have wondered ever since whether it was his position or his certainty. I like to think it was the certainty, that the man who had spent his life believing the quiet path was the kind one finally understood he had been wrong. I have no evidence except that Farrant, who could have made trouble for the rest of his career, made none, and retired quietly a year later, and sent Ivet Sorrel a letter that she keeps. She told me once, in the drawer where she keeps the things that matter. The inquiry's findings became law within the year. Every heavy goods vehicle on a designated steep route in Eldermoor now carries automatic braking. Every heavy vehicle license now requires the screening that would have saved Corvin Aldhouse's life. Every public events closure plan is reviewed against exactly the failure that nearly killed me. They are named, those reforms, in the dry way that laws are named, after the section and the schedule and the year. But everyone who worked on them called them, among themselves, by another name, and the name has stuck, and it is the name I am proudest of in the whole affair, because it honors the two people the day truly cost the most, the driver who died at his faultless wheel, and the young woman who paid for my life with her leg. They call them the Aldhouse Sorrel provisions. A good man's name and a brave woman's name, bolted together in the law of the kingdom, saving lives every year that neither of them will ever know about. There is no better honoring than that. There is no medal in the world that comes close to it. But there was a medal, too, in the end. I have to tell you about the medal, because the fight was won and the reforms were law, and the question of her conduct was closed forever, and the kingdom that had fallen in love with her still needed, to say so out loud. And this time there was no gray suit anywhere in the kingdom brave enough or foolish enough to whisper about a spectacle. They gave it to her at the palace in the spring when she was strong enough to stand, for she was determined to stand, and she did on her reconstructed leg, with a cane she leaned on more than she pretended to, and a limp she would carry for the rest of her days, but standing, upright, at attention, in the red tunic she had refused to be honored out of. The highest award the crown can give for gallantry is an old and rare thing in Eldermoor. It had been given 11 times in 100 years, and every previous recipient had been a soldier in a war, and most had received it after they were past caring, their names read out over graves. Ivet Sorrel received it standing up, alive, 25 years old by then, in the great hall of the palace with the whole court assembled, and her mother and her brother and her sister in the front row weeping without shame. The first time in the history of the award that the recipient had done the thing not in a war and not for a comrade, but for a stranger, in peacetime, in 3 seconds, on a set of cobblestones at a market fair. Saralind gave it to her herself. That was not usual either. Such things are more often done by the officers of the guard, in the guard's own manner. But the Queen had decided, and when the Queen has decided about a thing like this, there is no one to gainsay her, and so it was the sovereign of Eldermoor who pinned the ribbon at the throat of the tunic, with her own hands, the way she does the things that matter most, and who then did the thing that no protocol required, and that the whole hall will remember longer than the medal." She stepped back, the pinning done, and instead of moving on she stayed, and she looked at the young woman standing at attention before her. And then the Queen of Eldermoor inclined her head, bowed, a small, exact, unmistakable bow, the sovereign to the Lance-Corporal, and held it for a long moment, and the hall made a sound like a great indrawn breath, because a queen does not bow, a queen is bowed to. And everyone in that hall understood that they were watching the whole order of things turned upside down on purpose, by a queen who meant them to see it turned, who meant them to understand that there are debts that outrank rank, and that this was one, and that she paid her standing up and in the open where everyone could see. I stood at the side of the hall through all of it. I was well by then, mostly, the collarbone knit and the ribs healed, only the hip still speaking to me in cold weather as it has spoken to me ever since. And I watched my wife bow to the young woman who had saved my life, and I did not trust myself to make a sound, and I did not have to, because the whole hall made the sound for me. And when it was done, and the applause had risen and gone on far past the point where applause is meant to stop, Ivet Sorrel did the last characteristic thing of that whole long affair, the thing that told me she had come through all of it, the leg and the pain and the inquiry and the gray suits and the terrible love of a whole kingdom, and come through it still herself, still the girl from the hill farm, unspoiled and unchanged in the ways that counted. She looked through all that applause and all those cameras and all that overwhelming public honor, straight across the great hall, past the queen, past the court, to the side where I stood. And she found my eyes, and she gave me, not a salute, we were long past salutes by then, a small, private, plain look, the same plain, unguarded look she had given me from the white bed on the 5th day. And she made with her lips, without a sound, 2 words that no one else in that hall could see, and the 2 words were the same 2 words with which she had begun, the very first thing she had ever said to me, and they undid me then exactly as they had undone me in the infirmary. And I have never told anyone until now what they were. "I'm sorry," she mouthed to me across the great hall in the middle of the highest honor the kingdom could give her. "I'm sorry about your shoulder." And I mouthed back to her the thing I had been trying to make her understand for 6 months and had never quite found the words for. And I found them then at last. And they were the truest words I have ever said to anyone, and I will end her part of the story with them, because there is nothing I could add that would not diminish them. "Thank you," I mouthed back to her across the hall, past the queen, past the whole watching kingdom. "Not for the shoulder, for all of it. Thank you for choosing me. It has been 11 years since the fair at Harnwick, and I'm an old man now in earnest, and I find that I want to account for the loose threads before I put this story down, because a story that saves only its hero and leaves the rest to guess is a poor kind of gift, and I mean this to be a good one. Corvin Aldhouse, the driver, is not forgotten, and I have made it my particular business that he should not be. It would have been easy, in the great wash of feeling around Ivet, to let the man at the wheel become merely the cause, the faceless engine of the disaster, and I would not allow it, because he was faultless and good and died at his post as surely as any soldier. Only his post was the cab of a stone-lorry on a wet hill. I went to see his widow when I was well enough, and I go still once a year on the 9th of the 10th month. She is an old woman now too, and once she took my hand and told me it comforted her past all telling that her Corvin's name was in the law of the kingdom saving lives every year, bolted to the name of the brave girl, that she did not have to say my husband hurt the prince. She could say my husband's heart failed, and out of it came a law that has saved 100 hearts since. I sit, an old man with a stiff hip, on the small committee that reviews the Aldhouse Sorrel provisions, and I read the annual count of the lives the automatic brakes have saved, and I think of a good man's heart on a wet hill, and I am glad. The farm is safe. I promised her in the dark of that first night that her family would never want, and it was the one promise in the whole affair I was able to keep entirely on my own, without the queen or the inquiry or the kingdom's help, and I kept it quietly, and I will not say much about it, except that the fund the country raised was more than enough, and that what the fund did not cover, an old man with a stiff hip, and more money than a second son of a minor northern house has any right to, has been glad these 11 years to see to himself. Her brother is an engineer now, a good one, I am told, who works on exactly the kind of vehicle safety systems that his sister's leg helped write into law, which is the sort of thing that would seem too neat if you put it in a story, except that it is simply true, and the world is occasionally that kind. Her sister, the clever, impatient one, is a doctor. The sheep are still on the hillside. The grave of the father who died on the wet slope is tended, and beside the farmhouse door there is a small framed photograph of a queen bowing to a lance-corporal. And it is, Ivet's mother told me, the only picture in the house of anyone bowing to anyone, and she likes it there. And Ivet. She left the guard in the end. The leg would not let her stand a long post anymore, and she would not take a soft ceremonial appointment made out of pity, which anyone who knows her will understand at once. But she did not leave the thing the guard had been for. She trains them now. She became an instructor, and for 11 years she has stood in front of the newest and greenest of the Eldermoor Royal Guard, a woman with a cane and a limp, and the kingdom's highest award for gallantry that she never once wears. And she has taught them the thing that cannot really be taught, not the drill, not the stillness, but the other thing, the readiness to spend yourself, entire in 3 seconds, for a stranger, without stopping to ask whether the stranger is worth it. She tells them on the first day one thing about the day at Harnwick, and it is not about courage. She tells them that she does not remember deciding, that if they think, when the moment comes, that they will have time to decide, they are already too late, that the deciding has to be done now, in the long, dull hours of an ordinary post, in the person they choose to be before anything happens, so that when the 11 seconds come there is nothing left to decide, and only the doing remains. She was able to do it, she tells them, not because she was brave in the moment, but because she had, without knowing it, already decided, a long time before, on a hillside, as a girl of 15 who took up her dead father's work without pausing to ask whether it was fair. I have heard her say it. I sat quietly at the back of the training hall one afternoon, an old man no one recognized in a plain coat, and I heard her tell it to a room of 20-year-olds, and not one of them knew that the stranger she saved was sitting 10 feet behind them with tears running down his face. I go and see her still, of course. We are, after all this, something at last that I can put a name to. Not friends still, the word is too small, or the debt too large, I have never decided which. But there is a chair in her kitchen that is understood to be mine, and one in mine that is hers, and when the 9th of the 10th month comes around, after I have sat with the widow by the coast, I drive the last 2 valleys to the hill farm, and we sit, the pair of us, the man who was saved and the woman who saved him, and we do not talk about it much, because there is not much left to say, and we said the truest of it across a hall 11 years ago without making a sound. We watch the light go down over the 2 rivers. Mostly we are simply quiet together, 2 people bound by a thing that neither of us has ever fully understood, and I have come to think the not understanding is right, that some gifts are too large to be understood and can only be lived inside gratefully for as long as you are given. People still tell me I am a lucky man. I told you at the start that I have never had the heart to correct them, and that is true, but it is not the whole truth. I do not correct them because there is no correcting it in a sentence, and I have stopped trying. But I will tell you, who have stayed with me all this way, the thing I would say if a single sentence could hold it. I am not a lucky man. I am a chosen one. On a bright autumn morning at a market fair, with my back turned and my death 11 seconds away, a young woman I had spoken 40 words to looked at the whole indifferent geometry of the world and refused it, and chose me, and paid for the choosing with her body, and asked for nothing, and apologized for my shoulder. Luck is the world happening to you. What happened to me was a person, choosing at the cost of everything, to stand between me and the end of my life. There is a word for that, and it is not luck, and it is the oldest and best word we have. What she gave me was grace. Plain, human, unearned, unrepayable grace, in a red tunic on a set of wet cobblestones, and I have spent every one of the 11 years since trying to deserve it, and I never will, and that is exactly as it should be, because grace that could be deserved would not be grace at all. She would tell me I am making a fuss. She would be right. I can hear her saying it. And I find at the end of a long life mostly spent a careful half-step behind someone else's shoulder that there is one thing left in the world I am entirely unwilling to be quiet about, and it is her, and so I have not been quiet, and I am glad. Her name is Ivet Sorrel. She saved my life. Remember her.